What would you do if the child you raised, the one you once rocked to sleep and swore to protect, looked you in the eye and told you that your life, your house, and everything you built no longer belonged to you? My name is Thomas Grayson. I am 76 years old. And 3 months ago, my daughter handed me a letter that shattered every belief I ever had about family. It wasn't a birthday card or a note of love. It was a legal notice, declaring that I was to vacate my own home within 30 days. The air in the room froze when she slid the envelope across the dining table. Margaret, my only daughter, sat stiffly beside her husband, Richard, a man with a smile as sharp as a blade. I unfolded the letter with trembling hands, the words burning into my eyes. Notice to surrender property. My property. The house where I had laid every brick myself 40 years ago. The house where my wife Evelyn and I had raised our family until the day cancer stole her from me. This is best for you, Dad, Margaret said. Her voice rehearsed, almost mechanical. Richard kept his hand on her shoulder, pressing her forward, as though he were the puppeteer and she the doll. I wanted to believe I had misread it, that it was some cruel mistake. But the seal of a law office gleamed at the bottom of the page, and the signatures were real. My own daughter was evicting me. I stared at her, searching for the little girl who once clung to my hand at the county fair, who used to fall asleep in the back seat after long Sunday drives. All I saw was a woman hardened by greed, her eyes darting toward Richard each time I asked a question. Why? My voice cracked, but neither of them flinched. You can't take care of this place anymore, Richard said. You'll be better off somewhere smaller. Somewhere managed. These laughly in the rummed. I felt a wave of nausea. Managed. Like I was livestock being herded off to pasture. Grief had already taught me what it meant to lose Evelyn. But this betrayal, this blade in the back from my own flesh and blood, cut deeper than death itself. Because death is final and natural. Betrayal is a choice. And in that moment, as Richard smirked and Margaret avoided my gaze, I knew I was about to fight a battle I never thought I'd have to face. A war not on foreign soil, but inside my own family. I live in a cedar-sided house on the edge of a small New England town. The ocean is 15 minutes away. On autumn mornings, mist crawls over the marsh. I poured the footings the summer I turned 36. Evelyn picked the blue for the shutters. We had our small rituals. Saturday pancakes. Sunday service. I ran a cabinet shop on Main Street. We built kitchen tables that outlived marriages. I liked the smell of plain shavings and the bite of a sharp chisel. Evelyn taught music at the elementary school. Children who could not look a teacher in the eye would sing for her. At night, she practiced a simple hymn on our piano. I still hear the soft pedal. Margaret grew up in this house. She learned to measure twice and cut once. She learned to drive on the old Ford with the sticky clutch. She was stubborn but kind. When a stray dog followed her home in 7th grade, she named it Clover. Evelyn got sick in late winter. Doctors spoke in careful voices. I kept a notebook of numbers. We circled treatment dates on a wall calendar with a red pen. The piano went quiet before spring. After Evelyn died, the house did not breathe right. I walked by the harbor at dawn. I cooked too much soup. I learned to talk to an empty chair. The shop kept me going. Older men came by to sit on the stool near the belt sander. We talked about weather and knee pain. Some days we got work. Some days we did not. The world moved to fast kitchens and sealed board. Still, the locals asked for me when they wanted something real. Margaret married after college and moved to the city. Her calls came on speaker while she rushed between meetings. I smiled and said I was fine. She said she and her husband would visit soon. Months slipped by. Richard entered the picture like a salesman who never stops smiling. He came at Christmas with a scarf more expensive than my first pickup. He shook my hand with a grip that was all show. He called me sir even after I told him not to. He liked to talk about leverage and scale. He said money is lazy in a bank. I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. I keep the house in good order. The roof is sound. The furnace gets serviced each fall. I mow the yard in straight lines. I climb the stairs slow but steady. When it rains, I set a pot under one bad window. It is on my list. I help where I can. I pour coffee at the clinic on Tuesdays. I look in on Mrs. Doyle next door. She is 82 and still bakes. She brings me apple bread when I fix her porch light. Community is a chain. I did not see the storm at first. It looked like help. Margaret began asking about my health in careful texts. How are the stairs? Are you sleeping? Do you have a plan if you fall? Then came brochures for a residence by a lake in another state. The photos were bright and clean. Smiling people played cards near a stone fireplace. I thanked her and said I was fine. She sent more. Richard called with ideas. He said the market had cooled, and it was time to move assets. He said a buyer had asked about my land. He said we could sell high and rent a small place near them. He said I would love the gym and the pool. I told him I built this place with my hands. He said hands get tired. The first time they mentioned power of attorney, I laughed. I thought they were joking. The second time they brought a folder and a pen. I told them to put it away. I said we would talk later. They said later is how people lose their future. I said a man who rushes signs his life to strangers. Still, I tried to see my daughter under the worry. I told myself she was scared. I told myself she pictured a future where she would have to carry me and wanted to plan now. I told myself she believed him because she could not bear the quiet of the truth. Grief leaves people fragile. If a smooth voice offers a safe bridge, you might step without checking the rocks. I set new routines to steady the days. I walked at sunrise to the pier. I sharpened chisels. I called old friends. At night I played the hymn Evelyn loved. My hands are clumsy on the keys. The melody keeps the walls from closing in. I kept a box in the hall closet with documents and deeds. All in order. The town has a way of knowing when something is wrong. Mrs. Doyle watched me sweep the porch and said I looked thin. People sense a change in the wind before the branches move. I told them I was fine. I was not. When the letter arrived, I understood. It did not come alone. It came with new locks in a paper bag and a list of moving companies. It came with a soft voice saying, "This is best." It came with a smile that never reached his eyes. My world had shifted while I was looking at the past. This is where my story stands before the fall. A quiet house by the marsh. A widower who still sets a second plate without thinking. A daughter who braided her hair on the porch steps. A son-in-law with neat shoes and a plan. And a man who will learn how to stand his ground when the ground gives way. The first signs were small. A forgotten detail here. A word that did not fit there. I wanted to call it worry. The kind that brings soup and blankets. What came instead felt like a plan unfolding on my table while my back was turned. Margaret began to use a careful tone on the phone. She spoke as if reading lines. "Did you sleep? Are you eating? How are the stairs?" She once called me Dad. Lately, she said Thomas. "Are you listening?" Richard answered in the background. I heard the click of a pen and a television that never turned off. One afternoon, a white car rolled slow past my house and stopped. A woman stepped out with a printed smile. She asked if I had considered downsizing. She knew my name and lot number. She said her office had been contacted by a family representative. I told her no and closed the door. When I looked through the window, she was already on the phone, nodding as if someone had predicted my answer. Mail began to arrive with my name spelled in a new way. Thomas J. Grayson. I do not use the J. Flyers for senior communities filled my box. They came from towns I had never visited. 2 listed the same firm in the city where Margaret lives. At the bank, the manager asked if anyone would be added to my accounts. He asked twice. That afternoon, Margaret called to suggest joint access for emergencies. Just for peace of mind, she said. I told her I would think about it. Richard started to visit alone. He shook hands around town and praised my cabinets. Then touched a hinge and said it looked tired. He said this house was beginning to fail me. I found a new lock in a drawer I did not remember opening. The package was torn and the screws were missing. The back door key that hangs on a nail was not where I keep it. A folder had shifted an inch. It felt like someone had stepped out to adjust the set between scenes. The church office called to confirm my new mailing address. I told them I had not moved. They read a box number in a city Margaret likes to visit. The secretary apologized and said it must be a mistake. I told her it was not. That night I pulled the box of documents from the hall closet. I placed each paper on the table in a neat row. Deed. Insurance. Will. I checked for creases that should not be there. I thought of Evelyn and how she would rest a finger on a page when she was afraid and pretend to read. I could feel her finger on mine. I decided to test the ground. I called Margaret and said I might sell the old pickup. She went quiet, then hurried her words. If you sell, put the money in a high-yield account. Richard can help. Use this bank. Sign this form. I said I would sleep on it. 2 days later, an envelope arrived with the shop address. Inside was a draft power of attorney, with friendly instructions and little flags where a person should sign. A sticky note said, "I love you." My hands began to shake. I set the papers down as if they might burn. The next day, Richard appeared without calling. He praised my routine, then placed a folder on the table and asked me to sign just in case. He said it would make things easier if anything went wrong. I told him nothing is wrong. He smiled and said, "Accidents do not ask permission." I asked who had changed the church address. He said, "A clerical error." I asked if he knew the woman in the white car. He said no. I asked why the bank had called twice about adding names to my accounts. He said they were being proactive. Each answer arrived too fast and too smooth. He left with a hug that did not touch his chest. That evening, a message came from a number I did not know. Kindly reminder for Saturday tour. A driver will collect you at 9. The community name was Bright Harbor. I had never heard of it. When I checked the map, I found a field. Morning brought a new kind of pressure. Margaret called before sunrise. She said a neighbor had seen me stumble and had arranged a safety assessment. I asked which neighbor. She did not say. I told her not to send anyone. She said it had already been scheduled. The assessor wore a badge from a firm in the city. He measured doorways and asked about medications. He asked if someone helped with my bills. He asked if I ever forget the stove. I answered with patience, until he wrote a note I could not read upside down. It said, "Limited insight." Heat rose to my face. I signed his form to make him go. After he left, I called the clinic. The nurse stopped by for coffee and checked my pulse. She laughed at the idea that I was not steady. She said, "Some people use words to move a person into a box. Once you are in the box, it is easy to carry you where they want." I began to keep a notebook again. Dates, times, who said what. The first signs were on paper now, no longer scattered. They formed a line that pointed in one direction, away from the life I built, toward a future that did not ask if I wished to go. The first time, I chose to confront them. I told myself it would be calm. A father speaking to his daughter. A man asking for respect. What I got instead was a play already rehearsed, with each line spoken as if the ending had been written long before I opened my mouth. It was late afternoon when Margaret and Richard arrived. The sky had the heavy gray look of rain. I set 3 chairs at the dining table. The same table where Evelyn once served Sunday roasts and where Margaret did her homework. Now the table felt like a courtroom. They came in smiling too wide. Margaret kissed my cheek with lips that trembled. Richard shook my hand with that false grip, then set a thick folder on the table before he even removed his coat. "Dad, we've been worried," Margaret began, her eyes sliding toward Richard. "You're alone too much. The stairs, the yard, the winters here. It's all so much. As the billiant, I manage," I said. My voice was steady, though my heart pounded like a hammer. "I've lived here 40 years. I'll manage 40 more. As the billiant." Richard leaned forward, his cufflinks catching the light. "Thomas, we're not saying you can't cope now, but time doesn't ask permission. One slip on the stairs, one fall in the shower. You'll thank us for helping before it's too late." I opened my notebook and placed it on the table. Their eyes flicked to it. "I've been writing things down," I said. "Dates, calls, who stopped by, who sent forms." Gone. Margaret's face drained of color. Richard's jaw tightened. "You're imagining patterns," he said quickly. "This is concern, not conspiracy." I slid the envelope across the table. The power of attorney draft. This was in my mail. It didn't arrive by accident. Richard cleared his throat. "That's a standard document. For emergencies only. Every responsible family does this." His men. Responsible families, I repeated. Families that ask before moving their elders like pawns. His men. Margaret's hand trembled. "Dad, please. We're not trying to hurt you." His men. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to see Evelyn's kindness in her eyes. But all I saw was fear. Fear of losing something promised. Fear of disappointing the man beside her. "I'm not signing," I said. Richard's voice hardened. "Thomas, you're being reckless. Do you want your daughter to struggle when something happens to you? Do you want her to drown in debt while you cling to an old house?" "Debt?" I asked sharply. "So that's it. This isn't about me. It's about money you don't have and a life you can't afford. My death you sowed." Margaret's tears came fast, sliding down her cheeks. "It's not like that," she whispered. "It's exactly like that," I replied. Silence fell, broken only by the ticking clock on the mantel. I could hear Evelyn's piano in my memory. A soft hymn she once played when Margaret had nightmares. Now my daughter was crying for reasons Evelyn would never forgive. Richard gathered the folder, his movements sharp. "Think it over," he said. "But don't take too long. Opportunities pass." When they left, the house sank into heavy quiet. I sat with my notebook open, staring at the words I had written, the proof of what my instincts already knew. The first confrontation had ended without fists. But the battle lines were drawn. My daughter was caught between loyalty and greed, and the man she married had no intention of backing down. The day the truth stood up and named itself began with a phone call from the bank. The manager's voice was careful, as if he were walking on thin ice. "Mr. Grayson, we're confirming the standing instruction you placed to add an authorized signer to your accounts." The name he read was Richard Hale. My throat went dry. I told him no such instruction existed. He said a packet had been submitted online with scans of my license and a signature that looked like a cousin of my own. I asked him to freeze everything. He said he already had. He asked me to come in with identification. At the branch, the air smelled like toner and polished floors. The manager laid the forms between us. I looked at the signature. The loops were eager. The tail on the Y did not fall the way my hand makes it. The date had an extra space. Whoever did it had practiced. Then hurried. It was not a stranger. It was someone who had watched me write checks at Christmas. There was more. A new mailing address had been entered for statements. A box in a city tower I had never visited. I signed to restore my address and set a password only I knew. A word Evelyn used when she burned the toast and laughed. When I stepped outside, the wind off the harbor cut through my jacket. I went home by the back road and found a small envelope under my doormat. Inside was a business card for a mobile notary. The appointment time read tomorrow at 2. The note said final signatures for transfer. My hands shook so hard I had to sit. Transfer of what? To whom? The storm was no longer on the horizon. It was in my yard. That evening, Margaret came alone. She did not wear makeup. Her coat was buttoned wrong. She stood in the doorway like a child who knows she has done a terrible thing and is not yet ready to say it aloud. "Dad, can we talk?" Her voice was hoarse. We sat at the table. I set the notary card on the wood between us. The color drained from her face. "Please listen," she said. "Richard's business is not what he said. He borrowed to expand. Then the market turned. He promised returns he can't cover. If he misses another payment, they will sue us. He said there was a way. If we moved your assets for a short time, he could fix everything and put it back. I told him no. Then I told myself it was only temporary. I thought we were protecting you. I hear myself now and I know how that sounds. I kept my palms flat on the table. You were going to sign for me." She swallowed. "We were going to sign for you." The words came out a whisper. "Do you remember the night you were 9 and afraid of the dark?" I asked. "Your mother sat on the stairs and sang while the rain hit the roof. She told you love means you stay when storms come. Love does not push someone out of his own house to build a raft made of lies." She cried then. Not the thin tears of performance, but the heavy ones that bring gasps and leave salt on the lip. She said she was sorry. She said Richard needed just one signature. Just 1 week. And everything would be fine. She said the word fine until it sounded like a nail driven too far. The knock came at my back door. A man in a gray jacket stood with a tool roll. "Afternoon, sir. I'm here to rekey. Work order from the owner." He held up a paper that named my address and a company in the city. "The owner," I said. He pointed to a line. "Hale Property Holdings." Margaret went still. I stepped between the man and the lock. "You will leave now." He shrugged the way men shrug when a thing is not their problem. He left a card and backed down the steps, talking into his phone before he reached the gate. I slid the deadbolt. My hands would not stop shaking. In the kitchen light, my daughter looked 12. I wanted to put my coat around her shoulders and tell her monsters are not real. But the monster was in us. It wore a nice watch and called itself a solution. She rose to go. At the door, she turned. "If I walk away from him, I lose my life as I know it. If I stay, I lose you. What would you choose?" "Choose truth." I wanted to say, "Be safe." The father in me wanted to add. I chose the only honest sentence left. "I choose you. But I will not choose his plan. If he asks you to choose him or me, remember who held your hand when you learned to cross the street. Remember who will still be here when the storm passes." She left without her coat. The rooms leaned toward the door, as if waiting for the next knock. I opened the closet and took down the box of papers. Deed. Insurance. Birth certificates. I added the notary card. I added the locksmith card. I wrote today's date in the notebook. And the hour. And the way my daughter's voice sounded when she said we were going to sign for you. I did not sleep. Toward morning, I folded Evelyn's quilt at the foot of the bed the way she used to, and sat in the chair by the window. The marsh held a pale light. Geese rose in a ragged V, and the sound of their wings traveled like a message you cannot quite translate. I thought of the box number at the tower, and the handwriting that tried to be mine and failed. The truth had spoken. It had said what it was. I felt the cut of it, deep and clean. For a long time I let it hurt. When the sun finally cleared the pines, I knew what the next day would have to be. Not a plea, not a bargain, something harder and more honest than both. The morning I decided to act. The house smelled of rain-soaked cedar and old coffee. I sat at the table with my notebook open, the lines filled with dates, names, and fragments of conversations that would sound paranoid if spoken aloud. But on paper, the pattern was clear. Each visit, each envelope, each forged signature formed a chain that pointed to one conclusion. They meant to take everything. I folded the notebook and slipped it into my jacket. I drove into town, the tires humming over wet asphalt, and stopped at the office of a lawyer I knew from church. His name was Paul Simmons, a man with a patient voice and a habit of polishing his glasses when he thought hard. He listened without interrupting as I laid out the facts. When I finished, he tapped the notebook with one finger. "You've done more work than most clients," he said. "This is evidence, but we'll need stronger proof if we want to stop them before they act. I'll file a notice of concern with the court to freeze any property transfers. That buys you time, but you'll need eyes on them. Do you trust anyone?" I thought of the retired detective who plays cards at the Veterans Hall. His name is Alan Mercer, a man with a limp from an old case gone wrong, and a sense of justice that never healed. I called him that afternoon. He came by with a worn leather satchel and the tired eyes of someone who has watched too many good people get ruined by the greedy. "You're saying your son-in-law is orchestrating this?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "And my daughter is caught in it, whether she's a prisoner or an accomplice. I can't yet tell." Created where called in. 7-way. Alan set a small recorder on the table. "Then we'll find out. I'll plant a line on your phone. I'll watch the house. But you need to keep talking to them. Make them believe you're considering it. Their words will convict them." Created where called in. 7-way. It felt strange, conspiring against my own blood. But what choice was left? Evelyn's picture on the mantel seemed to watch me, as if asking whether this fight was worth the cost. I whispered to her that I had no choice. The next day Richard called, his voice slick with confidence. "Thomas, we're moving forward. I'll send the papers Saturday. Just be ready to sign. Margaret is worried sick about you living alone." And said, I forced my tone flat. "Send what you need. I'll review it." And said, Alan nodded from across the table as the recorder blinked red. After the call ended, he played back the words. Each syllable sounded more damning when echoed from a machine. That evening I drove to the bank again. I asked for copies of every suspicious request, every false address, every attempt to alter my account. The clerk hesitated until I leaned close and said, "This is my life they're trying to steal. Either help me now or explain to the police why you looked the other way." Papers were printed. I carried them home in a folder that felt heavier than wood. Margaret visited once more before the storm broke. She stood in my kitchen, twisting her wedding band, her face pale. "Dad, Richard says you're hesitating. He says if you delay, the opportunity will vanish." They did. I set a mug of coffee in front of her and asked quietly, "Opportunity for whom? Margaret? For you to save your marriage? Or for him to bury me alive in paperwork?" Her eyes filled, but she didn't answer. She reached for the mug with trembling hands. Alan's recorder sat hidden beneath the table. That night, sleep refused me. I sat by the window, the marsh alive with the sound of frogs and distant thunder. In the glass, my reflection looked like a soldier before a battle, older, slower, but with enough fight left to strike one more blow. The decision was sealed. I would not wait for them to lock me out of my own life. With Alan's help, I would gather every word, every forged line, every lie. And when the time came, I would place it all in the hands of the law. I closed the notebook and whispered into the quiet. If you want my house, Richard, you'll have to steal it from a man who is wide awake. Ask Kay, secrets hide in plain sight. When Alan spread his files across my dining table, truth did not arrive as thunder. It came as dates that matched, names that repeated, and a map drawn by greed. He spent 2 days moving like a shadow. He watched Richard walk into a glass tower downtown, the same tower that held the box address tied to my accounts. He photographed him meeting a man in a lobby cafe. Alan ran the plates on the car that took them to lunch. It belonged to a firm that calls itself a family office. Next came paper. Hale Property Holdings is a shell with a mail store address. Its agent files for dozens of companies. The filings show no employees and almost no cash. 2 months ago, the shell recorded a purchase offer on a parcel by the river. The deposit vanished. The seller is suing a ghost. Alan printed bank notices linked to my attempted account change. The requests came from a public network in the city. Times line up with the hours Richard met clients. The signature on the packet lifted a curve from an old check I mailed to Margaret years ago. I saw my own hand twisted into an instrument. He dug into Bright Harbor, the residence that sent a driver to collect me. The address is a contractor yard behind Chainlink. Another location on their brochure is a condo used for weekly rentals. Photos of card games and lakeside walks came from a stock site. He traced the mobile notary who left her card under my mat. Her name is Carla Price. She advertises speed and confidentiality. 2 years ago, she settled a complaint for notarizing a deed without the owner present. The board fined her. Last week, she bought a new car with cash. The bill of sale lists the buyer as Hale Property Holdings. It went deeper. Alan found a lien on Richard, filed by a lender that specializes in bridge loans. The rate would make a sober man dizzy. The collateral listed future fees from a project that never broke ground. Payments are past due. If he misses another, the lender can sweep any account tied to his name. Alan looked at me. That is why he needs new accounts to appear. He is building a raft out of your savings. We drove to the coast to see a woman named Lydia Hart. Her brother lost his house last year. The story matched mine. A son-in-law with a plan. A notary at the kitchen table. A deed to an entity as thin as air. The brother died in a rented room. Lydia pressed a folded eviction notice into my hand. "Do not sign a thing," she said. At dusk, Alan returned with one more piece. He visited Margaret at her office. He did not push. He told her a judge can forgive fear but not fraud. When he left, she sent me a message. "I am at your door. Please let me in." She stood on the porch with a paper bag and a face that looked older. Inside were emails and a flash drive. She had printed what she could at work and photographed the rest. The messages were not careful. They spoke of quiet notarizations. They spoke of swapping my address and keeping me busy while papers moved. They promised that once the transfer cleared, Richard would settle the lender and return my place without a trace. "A week," he wrote. He used the word safe like a charm. I asked if she had sent any forms. A small nod. She had uploaded scans of my license from a file she kept after renewing my insurance. She had filmed my signature on a birthday card and sent it to a designer to match the slope. The shame on her face was a thing with weight. She did not ask me to forgive it. She only asked me to see it. Then she told me the part that changed the air. They had booked a closing with Carla for Friday at 2. They had set a meeting with a bank officer for Friday at 4 to move funds into an account in the name of Hale Property Holdings and a second account in the name of a wellness foundation. The foundation does not exist. The number on the file routes to a burner phone. The path was designed to split and confuse, then sprint overseas. Alan wrote the timeline on a yellow pad. "We have 48 hours, he said. Less if they bring the notary early. He pulled out a small device and showed Margaret how to record calls. He asked her to phone Richard from my kitchen and ask him to repeat the plan. She did. Her hands shook. She put the phone on speaker. Richard answered with a warm voice that never warmed the room. "You will meet Carla at 2, he said. "Your father will be there or not. We have the notarized sample if he tries to make a scene. The deed moves first. Then the account. The lender gets paid and the rest goes where it needs to go. By Monday we are out of the woods. Tell him it is best. Use the word safe." Alan saved the recording to 2 drives. He looked at me and gave a small nod. The secret was no longer a shadow. It had a schedule. It had names and signatures. It had a clock that now ticked in my house. Margaret sat very still. I poured water and set the glass in front of her. My daughter whispered that she was ready to testify if it came to that. She asked if there was a way to save her marriage. I told her the truth. A promise is worth nothing if it is paid for with stolen lives. Alan stood to leave. "Be ready," he said. "He will test your door and your will. He will think you are alone. You are not." I stood at the window and watched the lane. The marsh breathed its slow breath. There is a kind of strength that does not raise its voice. It keeps records. It waits. It meets the secret in daylight and calls it by its true name. The day of reckoning began with a stillness that felt wrong. No birdsong. No rustle in the marsh grass. Just the heavy silence of a house holding its breath. I rose early, dressed in my best shirt, and placed Evelyn's photograph on the mantel where I could see her face. I whispered that this was for us, for the home we had built, for the love that should have been enough. Alan arrived before noon. His limp more pronounced in the damp air. He carried a case of equipment, 2 small recorders, a camera the size of a matchbox, and a folder thick with statements. He set them up with the precision of a man preparing for a trial rather than a fight. "Let them talk," he said. "Let them believe you are bending. That's when they will reveal everything." And to see they, at 1:45, Margaret's car pulled into the drive. She stepped out slowly, eyes red-rimmed, clutching her purse as though it might anchor her. Richard followed, immaculate as ever, briefcase swinging like a weapon. His stride was full of confidence. The stride of a man who thought he owned the ground he walked on. They entered without knocking. Richard laid his briefcase on my dining table, spreading out documents with the assurance of a surgeon arranging tools. "Today is the day, Thomas," he said. "By tonight you'll be free of responsibility. Margaret and I will handle everything. You'll be safe." Tuetha, safe. The word stung. Margaret's hands shook as she set a glass of water in front of me. Her eyes begged me not to sign, but her lips stayed shut. She was still trapped in his orbit, still hoping he might change if the storm passed. Richard pointed to the first form. "Here's the deed transfer. Just sign at the flags. Carla will notarize. Then we move to the banking forms. Simple. Efficient." Friend in the past. I picked up the pen. Its weight felt like a test. My hand hovered over the paper. Across the room, Alan's recorder blinked red. "Explain it again," I said softly. "I want to be sure." "Anywell the main." Richard leaned forward, his voice lowering as though confiding in a partner. "We use the deed to shift ownership to Hale Property Holdings. Once that's in place, we open the new account. The funds transfer instantly. The lender is satisfied. No one chases us. Your money doubles in a year. Maybe less. Everyone wins." "Anywell the main." "Everyone?" I asked. "Of course," he said, flashing that razor smile. "We carry the burden. You enjoy peace. We've never." Margaret's breath hitched. A faint sound, like a sob strangled before birth. Richard shot her a glance sharp enough to cut. She lowered her head. Silent again. I set the pen down. You've thought of everything. We've never. Richard nodded. That's why you should trust me. This is family. We've never. Family. The word tasted bitter. I looked from him to my daughter, then back to the man who dared to call theft love. My pulse thudded in my ears. The choice loomed. Surrender and lose everything, or strike back and risk shattering what little remained of my bond with Margaret. I drew a slow breath. There's one thing you forgot. He one of them. Richard blinked. And what's that? That I'm not alone. He one of them. At that moment, Alan stepped from the hallway, his badge from years past gleaming in his palm. Richard's face drained of color, then hardened into rage. This is entrapment, he snapped. You can't prove. Alan clicked the recorder. Richard's own voice spilled into the room, every damning word replayed with icy clarity. Margaret covered her mouth, tears spilling freely now. Richard lunged for the device, but I stood. My old hands caught his wrist with a strength he hadn't expected. You underestimated me, I said. You thought grief made me weak. You forgot grief can also forge steel. Very will be cat of, he froze. The fight draining as sirens wailed faint in the distance. Margaret crumpled into the nearest chair, her sobs shaking the air. The confrontation was over, but the wreckage lay plain. A daughter torn between blood and betrayal, a son-in-law caught in his own net, and an old man standing in the ruins of trust. When the sirens grew louder, I looked once more at Evelyn's photo. It's done, I whispered, but the cost will haunt me forever. There, Asco. Sirens rolled into the drive. Red and blue light washed over the walls and over Evelyn's picture. Richard stood rigid. Margaret kept her hands twisted in her lap. Alan's voice stayed level. Stay where you are. No one moves. 2 officers entered. The older was Sergeant Cole. The younger officer Diaz. I said I had called to report an attempt to take my house and my money with forged papers and a false notary. I pointed to the folder. Alan raised the recorder. Cole asked for identification. I gave my license and the deed from the hall box. He compared names, then asked Richard for his license. Richard talked fast about concern and family. Cole listened without nodding. He turned to Margaret. Did you ask your father to sign anything today? She whispered yes. Are the papers proper? She said she did not know anymore. Then set a flash drive on the table. Alan played the recording. Richard's voice filled the room. We use the deed to shift ownership to Hale Property Holdings. The lender is satisfied. The rest goes where it needs to go. By Monday, we are out of the woods. Tell him it is best. Use the word safe. Diaz photographed each page and the flags where my name should go. Richard tried a new story. He said I had consented earlier and that I had memory problems. He said the presence of a former detective proved this was a trap. Cole asked one question. Did Mr. Grayson sign anything? Richard said not yet. Then there is no transfer. Cole said, and if there is a forged sample, we will see it. I told them about the bank call, the change of address, the box in the tower, the driver who never came because the address was a yard behind chain link. I gave the card from the notary and the work order for new locks. Diaz wrote as I spoke. Cole's pen tapped when I named the lender. Cole asked Margaret to step into the kitchen. When she returned, her eyes were red, but her chin was steady. She said she would give a statement and placed her phone by the drive. She could not look at Richard. Alan set new sheets on the table. He showed the lien and the shell filings. He showed the fake addresses for Bright Harbor and a past complaint against the same notary. He let the paper speak. Cole faced me. Do you wish to press charges? The question landed like a weight I had carried for weeks. I looked at Margaret. I looked at Evelyn's picture. I heard the hymn she used to play. I said yes. Richard's mask slipped. He reached for the folder. Diaz blocked him. Cole told him to place his hands behind his back. Richard talked about lawyers and connections. He called me ungrateful. The cuffs closed with a final sound. 2 more patrol cars painted the lane with light. Neighbors watched with quiet sympathy. People here know when a line is crossed. Cole read the rights. Richard kept speaking anyway. They led him to the car. He looked back once as if to say, "This is not over." I stood a little taller, so he could see that for me it was. Inside, Margaret folded into the dining chair. Cole asked if she understood what cooperation meant. She nodded. She asked if I would be safe tonight. Cole said a patrol would pass by and that the court could freeze any transfer and bar contact until a hearing. We drove to the station. A clerk copied the recording and the emails. Cole took our statements. Margaret began in a thin voice and then steadied. She explained how Richard promised that a short transfer would fix a debt with no harm. She explained how he told her to gather my documents and to send a video of my signature so a designer could match the slope. She explained how the notary would finish the deed if I refused to sit at the table. I signed an affidavit. Alan signed as witness. A prosecutor approved charges for attempted fraud, attempted theft, conspiracy, and forgery. A judge signed a temporary order to freeze my deed and accounts and to bar contact, and set a hearing for the next week. When we left, stars showed through thin cloud. Margaret stood beside me on the steps. She said she was sorry. She said it again until the word emptied out and then filled with meaning. I told her the only words I could say without breaking. Go home with the officer. Sleep. Come back tomorrow. Tell the rest. At home I made tea, though I did not want it. I sat in the dark. The house felt different. Not safe yet. Not healed. But steady. In the quiet, I felt the ache in my chest and the odd peace that follows a hard choice. The storm had not ended, but I had done the one thing a man can do when his world is taken in slow inches. I had said no and made the word hold. Near midnight, the phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number said I would regret this. Another said there were things I did not know about my daughter and that I should check my shop in the morning. I sent the messages to Alan. He told me to lock the doors and to sleep with the phone on the nightstand. I lay awake and watched the ceiling. Each minute stretched. I thought of Evelyn and the piano and the small smile she gave when she approved of my work. Around 2, I slept for a while and dreamed of the marsh at low tide and a narrow path that led home. At dawn, I brewed coffee and opened the notebook. I wrote the names of the officers and the judge and the charges. I wrote one more line. I had earned the right to write. Today I chose the law. Today I chose myself. The courthouse smelled of old paper and floor polish. Light filtered through tall windows onto worn benches polished by decades of waiting. I sat between Alan and Margaret. My hands folded over the notebook I carried like armor. Across the aisle, Richard entered in shackles. His hair slicked back. Jaw clenched, still trying to project power, even as the cuffs bit into his wrists. The prosecutor spoke first. She laid out the charges: attempted fraud, conspiracy, elder financial exploitation. She read excerpts from the transcripts Alan had compiled. Richard's voice filled the chamber, promising that my signature would be handled with or without me. Each word landed like a nail driven into the floor. When asked for his plea, Richard stood, eyes scanning the room. Not guilty, he said, his tone smooth, as if the evidence piled against him were smoke that could be waved away. Then it was Margaret's turn. Her voice shook at first, but she found steadiness in the silence. She admitted her role, how she had scanned my license and filmed my handwriting. She said she believed Richard when he told her it was temporary, that no one would be hurt. Her words were a confession and a plea at once. She entered a guilty plea to reduce charges in exchange for cooperation. I sat listening, my chest heavy. It is one thing to know betrayal in your bones. It is another to hear it spoken by your own child in a room full of strangers. The judge, a woman with sharp eyes, turned her gaze on me. "Mr. Grayson, would you like to give a statement?" I rose slowly. My knees ached, but my voice came clear. "I built my house with my hands. I buried my wife in that town. I raised my daughter there. What was stolen from me was not only nearly my property, but my trust. A son-in-law sought to erase my life's work with forged papers. A daughter I love helped him. The law can decide how long a man spends behind bars, but no court can restore a bond once broken. That is the wound I carry. Not 9 Makerzid for Eunice." Reporters scribbled. The prosecutor nodded. Richard sneered. Margaret wept quietly. Her head bowed. Sentencing came after 2 long hours of testimony. Richard was given 7 years in state prison, followed by probation, with restitution to be paid from any seized assets. His attempt at protest was drowned by the sound of the gavel. Margaret received 2 years of probation, community service, and mandatory counseling. The judge's words were firm. "You betrayed your own father. This court will not excuse it, even as it spares you prison." And to Tinu, the room exhaled as if the air itself had been waiting. I felt no victory, only exhaustion. Alan touched my arm. "It's over, Thomas," he said softly. But I knew it was not. The law had spoken. Yes, but the echo of betrayal would linger. Outside, cameras flashed. Neighbors asked if I felt relieved. I answered truthfully, "Justice isn't relief. It's a reckoning." Oh. That night the house was quiet in a way that pressed on my chest. No papers spread across the table. No knocks at the door. No voices urging me to sign. Yet the silence was not peace. It was the silence after a storm, when debris still clutters the ground, and scars mark the land. I walked room to room, touching the walls Evelyn once painted, the table she polished, the quilt she sewed. The house was mine again, but it felt lonelier than ever. Margaret had chosen confession over denial, but that did not erase the image of her handing me forms with my forged name. I poured a glass of water, sat by the window, and wrote in the notebook. I wrote the word justice, then crossed it out. I wrote the word loss, then I closed the book. The morning after sentencing, the house felt like a museum. Every room carried a label only I could read. Here is where she practiced scales. Here is where we ate soup when the power failed. Here is where my daughter placed a pen beside a lie. I moved quietly, as if my steps might disturb dust that remembered better days. I tried to make coffee and spilled grounds. I wiped the mess and stared at the stain the way a man stares at a wound that will not close. Grief wears many uniforms. That day it wore silence. Alan called. He asked if I wanted company. I said I needed to hear the house breathe. In the afternoon, I went to the shop. I pulled a rough plank from the rack and planed until the grain ran like a river. The smell settled my chest. I built a small box without a nail in it, lined it with felt, and set it on the piano. Evelyn's metronome fit inside as if it had been waiting. When I started it, the tick returned to the room, soft and faithful. Mrs. Doyle knocked with chicken soup and a wrinkled hand on my sleeve. She did not ask for details. She said she was proud I had stood up. After she left, I stood at the sink and cried. Sudden and plain. On Thursday, the church asked if I would speak to a few seniors about boundaries. I talked in a hall that smelled like hymn books. I told them to keep papers in their own hands, to write down dates, and to trust the voice that rises in the chest when something is wrong. They nodded. I began to walk again at dawn. The marsh held a gray light. Geese stitched the sky. The tide drew slow lines in the mud. A young voice on the radio predicted rain and laughed. It made me think of Margaret when she was 11 and believed tomorrow could only be better. She wrote me a letter. It arrived in a plain envelope with my name printed carefully. She said she was in counseling and had told the truth from start to finish. She was working hours at a pantry and had never known how many people stacked courage into boxes and called it groceries. She did not ask me to forgive her. She asked if we could sit in the same room without talking. The way a person warms a frozen hand before feeling returns. I wrote back that we could meet on Sunday after service in the church garden where Evelyn used to weed the edge bed. I asked her to come alone. Sunday came with a bright wind. Margaret walked down the path in a plain coat, her face bare. We sat on a bench made from a fallen maple. For a long time we listened to bees in the last clover. Then she began. She told me what fear had done in her mind. It had turned good advice into danger and bad advice into safety. It had rewritten the story so that lies sounded like plans. Richard said I would be safer if he handled everything because he was strong and I was tired. Leaving him would mean admitting she had been wrong from the start. Pride kept her longer than love. Pride and debt. I spoke of my own pride. After Evelyn died, I refused help because I wanted to prove I could stand without a hand on my elbow. I told myself distance gave Margaret room to build a life, when what it sometimes gave was an open door for a voice like Richard's. We sat with those truths, the way a carpenter sits with a board and waits to hear if it will crack. We set rules. No forms without 2 pairs of eyes. No signatures without a lawyer present. No new keys on anyone's ring. We wrote them in my notebook like a contract between 2 scared people who want to be brave. Healing did not rush in. It walked. Some days we took 3 steps. Some days, none. On the days when anger raised its head, I went to the shop and cut dovetails. On the days when shame dragged her shoulders, Margaret stacked boxes at the pantry and listened to stories that made her smaller and better. Toward the end of the month, the school called. The old piano bench had split. Would I look at it? I knelt where Evelyn had once sat, to help frightened kids find middle C. I replaced the cracked rails with ash and glued the mortises tight. 7th graders sung around. Then a hymn I knew too well. I did not make it through the 2nd verse. I stood in the hallway until my breath learned the stairs again. The shop began to fill with small jobs. A woman needed a frame for a wedding photo. A fisherman brought an oar to mend. A teenager asked if I would teach him to make a box like the one on my piano. His name was Nate. He worked after school and said he wanted to build a guitar someday. I put a scrap of cedar in his hand and told him wood remembers kindness. At night I set the metronome and put my fingers on the keys. I learned a new hymn for Evelyn and one old tune for myself. The house no longer felt like a museum. It felt like a workshop where a long repair was underway. I did not forgive Margaret in a moment. I forgave her in small pieces. The way a shoreline forgives a storm, by letting the tide return twice a day. Every time she kept a promise, the tide came back a little clearer. One evening, I returned the soup lid to Mrs. Doyle. She pressed a loaf into my hands and said the street seemed quieter now. I said the house was beginning to breathe again. She patted my shoulder and said so was I. When I went home, the porch light glowed. The yellow Evelyn chose. I locked the door and set the kettle on. I opened the notebook and wrote a word I had not written in months. Begin. Then I let the metronome tick. A small, brave heart keeping time in a house that had remembered how to live. Autumn rolled over the marsh with a slow hand. Leaves turned copper. Air sharpened. And the nights pressed longer. I found myself listening to the wind in the siding, to the tick of Evelyn's metronome, to the sound of my own breath. Each note reminded me that I was still here. I started new routines. On Mondays, I walked with Nate, the boy from the shop. He learned to cut dovetails. His young hands clumsy but eager. When he asked why I still worked at my age, I told him wood does not care about age. It only asks if you are patient. On Wednesdays I volunteered at the pantry where Margaret worked her hours. We did not speak much. We stacked cans side by side and passed boxes to families with quiet nods. It was more than silence. It was a language of repair. One evening Margaret came to the shop after closing. She held out a rough sketch of a table. "For the pantry," she said, "strong enough to hold crates." Her voice wavered. I studied the lines and nodded. We spent 3 weeks shaping pine into something sturdy. She sanded until her hands blistered. I guided her grip. When the table stood level, she pressed her palms to the surface and whispered, "I want to build things, not break them." The neighbors began to see me as more than the old man who had nearly lost everything. They invited me to speak at the library about protecting elders from fraud. I stood under fluorescent lights, telling strangers how I nearly signed away my life, how vigilance is not paranoia, how love can be twisted into a weapon. Some cried. Some took notes. Afterward, a woman hugged me and said her brother had been tricked by his caretaker. She promised to fight for him. Alan stopped by often. He said the case was being used in training sessions for younger detectives. He called me a survivor. I told him survival is not enough, you must learn to live after. He smiled and poured coffee into mismatched mugs. At night the house was not as heavy. Margaret began to visit on Sundays. Sometimes with bread. Sometimes with nothing but her presence. She never asked for forgiveness outright. Instead, she washed dishes beside me, trimmed the roses Evelyn planted, sat on the porch with folded hands. Forgiveness grew like a tree, slow, uneven, but real. The hardest moment came when I opened the drawer where I kept her first letter of confession. I read it again. Every crooked line, every desperate plea. I folded it carefully and placed it beside my notebook. Then I wrote across a blank page. The words did not erase the past. They built a bridge to the future. In November, the church held a supper. Margaret stood beside me as we served stew. People greeted her with cautious warmth. She kept her eyes down. But when a child tugged her sleeve and thanked her, she smiled like the girl I once knew. I felt Evelyn's hand in the room. Unseen, but steady. The marsh froze at the edges as winter came. I lit the stove and worked in the shop by lamplight. Nate brought his guitar. Half-built. Strings loose. Body rough. We carved until the shape found music. He strummed a few notes. The sound was raw but hopeful. Hope. That was the word I had nearly lost. Now it lived in small things. A boy learning craft. A daughter stacking boxes. A community listening. A house breathing again. One night Margaret asked if she could play the piano. She sat where her mother once sat, touched the keys with hesitant fingers, and played the hymn Evelyn had loved. Her hands faltered, but the melody filled the house. I closed my eyes and let it wash over me. The music was not perfect, but neither are we. Still, it carried the weight of trying. I realized then that my life was not ending in betrayal. It was unfolding into something scarred but alive. The storm had taken much, but in its wake grew a quiet garden of second chances. What do we carry when the storms end? Not only the scars, but the lessons written beneath them. I carry both. It has been nearly a year since Richard was sentenced. He writes letters I do not read. Margaret says he blames me. Blames her. Blames anyone but himself. Perhaps prison will teach him what love and law could not. Perhaps not. Either way, I no longer hold his weight on my shoulders. Margaret walks with me most Sundays. Sometimes we talk. Sometimes we do not. Forgiveness is not a door you fling wide. It is a latch you test slowly. each time with trembling hands. Some days I can open it a little. Some days I cannot. But at least, it is no longer locked. The shop smells of cedar again. Nate finished his guitar. He played it at church last month. His music was rough. But he looked at me afterward with a grin so wide it made my chest ache with pride. I told him wood remembers kindness. And now, music does too. One evening I sat at the piano. Margaret turned the metronome. Together we played the hymn Evelyn loved. Missing notes. Laughing at our clumsy hands. For a moment, I felt my wife in the room. Not as memory, but as presence. The way love lingers when walls have heard it too often to forget. I look back now at the man who almost signed his life away. Who nearly lost everything to paper and lies. He was broken. But he was not finished. He learned that strength does not always come from swinging a hammer or standing taller than another man. Sometimes strength is simply saying no when the world demands yes. To those who listen to my story, I offer this. Guard what you build. Not just your house. Not just your savings. But the trust that binds you to those you love. Ask hard questions. Write things down. And when someone tells you they know what is best for you, remember that you are the only one who has lived your life. Brick by brick. Day by day. I will die someday, as all men do. But I will not be angry. I will die in the house I built with Evelyn, with the music of her hymn in my ears, with my daughter sitting beside me, still learning how to be true. And maybe, just maybe, those who hear this story will hold their loved ones closer, will see the thin line between care and control, between love and betrayal, and will choose to honor the bonds that no paper should ever break. Because in the end, a home is not wood and nails. It is the people who keep faith inside its walls. And though mine was nearly stolen, it still stands. I still stand.